Now let's discuss a substantially different scenario. This is when we raise under the gun +1 and the button calls. So now under the gun +1 is out of position. Previously we were in position. Now we're out of position, okay? So flop comes 9-7-5. Under the gun +1 bets 33% pot. Button calls. All right? On the turn, you'll notice immediately we actually have a pretty good amount of equity on all turns. And you may say, why in the world is this? Well, it's because when we're betting the flop to begin with, we are going to be betting much more polarized because we're out of position, right? And this board's not particularly great for under the gun +1. So when we're betting polarized on the flop, that is usually going to lead to us being able to continue betting on a decent amount of turns. Now, the problem with this spot is that we're out of position. And when you're out of position, you still have to do a lot of checking. If you went back to the previous examples and spots where you saw 58% equity, which I don't even know if we had 58% equity in any of them. Let's go back to this one. You see under the gun +1 against big blind on like a king. In that scenario, you got to bet 65% of the time with 57% equity, right? But in this scenario, with 58% equity, you see you can actually only bet 40% of the time. And that's, again, because you are out of position. When you're out of position, you have to do a lot of checking. You just have to. And then when you do bet, you are betting very polarized. So let's take a look at the equities on various turns. This is a spot where if you get an ace on the turn, that's usually just good for the pre-flop raiser because they have the best aces. Then a king, a queen, a jack, a 10 are all like kind of marginal. Notice a 9 is actually pretty good too, and that's because you would bet with basically all of your top pairs on the flop, and on 9-7-5 you actually still do have a decent amount of 9s in your under the gun +1 opening range. 8 and a 6 are not very good at all because it's very easy for the player on the button to have an 8 or a 6 that would always call the flop. So that's not particularly great. And that's reflected in this right here. Notice on an 8 or a 6, you essentially never bet, which is pretty cool to see, right? And there will be some turns like this, especially as we look at spots that are even like better and better for a particular player, where they end up checking, like the player with who's lacking the equity has to check a large chunk of the time. Okay, so let's take a look at under the gun +1 against button 9-7-5-2. The 2 is essentially a blank. But because we're betting polarized to begin with on the flop, the 2 doesn't really change much, which generally will allow you to continue betting with premium made hands, draws, marginal made hands, and junk. Go through and categorize your range. So far, the previous 2 examples we've gone through, you've had your entire flop range on the turn. That's because you continuation bet 100% of hands on the flop. Here, I did not continuation bet 100% of hands. And this is where the implementable strategy I'm showing you here is going to deviate a decent amount from the solver. And that's because the solver is going to be using a mixed strategy across the board. Like solver is going to have some aces, some kings, some ace king, some ace queen, some ace jack, some ace 7. Not all ace 10 suited, not all ace 9 suited, only some of them, right? And that's going to result in the ranges we get to on the turn actually being a decent amount different. So you can't look at the solver's actual strategy and presume that's what you should be doing. But you should still look at the hands that are like always betting versus always checking and make sure those are at least lining up somewhat reasonably. So let's go through and categorize our hands. We have overpairs, which are great. We have top pair, which is good. Top pair marginal kicker I have is marginal made hand. I have ace 10 as a marginal made hand. Maybe it's junk. It's somewhere in there. Then we have draws, which are the 8s, the 6s, and then various overcards. And then we have some junk. I may actually just bet king jack here, because notice here we actually have a little bit too much junk. So given we have a little bit too much junk, because we want a 70-30 ratio, this is more like a 60-40 ratio. Given we have a little bit too much junk, if I took 3 combinations of king jack here and put them in my draw category, that range is still roughly balanced, and this range is a little bit stronger when we check. So that's probably the right thing to do if I was to go back and remake this image. So I think this is pretty nice and logical, right? We have a 1-to-1 ratio. Like I said, we would remake this to be 70-30, and we should be good to go. This has us betting 75% of the time. Notice the solver, though, actually checks a ton. And you may say, why are you betting so often with the solver's checking so often? It's because, take a look, solver has a lot of these ace-high type hands, right, that are not in very great shape. And whenever you have a lot of these ace-high type hands that are not in very great shape on this turn, after you bet and get called, you just have to do a lot of checking. But notice I don't have any of those in my range, which, if we were trying to be perfectly GTO or it's even slightly more implementable than we were, maybe we like bet ace jack on the flop or something. Notice we did bet ace 10 on the flop, right? So maybe we should be betting just even a little bit more. Then we'd have more ace x. That would allow us to check more, etc., etc. But recognize this is not the range we get to the turn with. Also notice the solver is still mixing with basically every hand in its range. It's betting king sometimes and checking it sometimes. Only really the overpairs are the only hands that do a ton of one particular play. Queens, jacks, and tens. I guess fives does a lot of checking. Fours does a lot of checking. Fives for the slow play, by the way. Middle pair checks a ton. Bottom pair checks a ton. Top pair checks a decent amount. So, it's good to see, but again, I don't think you should extrapolate too much from this strategy and think, oh, I need to try to copy that. Now we have under the gun +1 against button. 9, 7, 5 turns a 9. Remember, this is a good turn for the under the gun +1 player, even though it may not intuitively seem like it, because obviously the button has a lot of 9s too. But if you look at our range here, we have overpairs, which are great, 9s, which are great, and full houses, which are great. And then our draws still have a decent amount of equity, right? Like the 8s all have gut shots, 6s has gut shots. Then these overcards, a lot of them would normally be considered junk, but notice we don't actually have any marginal made hands, which is kind of interesting, right? So due to betting very polarized on this flop, when top pair pairs, all of our top pairs that we bet on the flop are still very, very good. They actually got even stronger. And that allows you to continue betting the turn very frequently. And anytime you see your range line up to where you have like a ton of premium hands, like we do here, and very few marginal made hands, like I guess we could call ace 10 a marginal made hand, but it's not really, right? Given we have relatively few marginal made hands, we essentially need to take all of the potentially marginal made hands and all the junk, as long as it's not too much, and use that as a bet. So this is a spot where I'm definitely going to be betting everything in this scenario. And even here, like king, queen, king, jack, king, 10, these effectively count as draws because they could get there, right? If your opponent calls your turn bet with ace 7 or 8-7 and you get a king on the turn, you win. Or a king on the river, you win. So these definitely count as draws, and you should probably bet with everything. But again, this is going to be different than what the solver does because the solver's going to have a more mixed strategy out of position. So as you see, like every hand, it's only got 50% of it or less. And you see, solver has a lot of these random ace highs that are quite weak, whereas I did not. I was betting more polarized than the solver, essentially. Solver does bet all of its 9s, bets its overpairs, bets a lot of these random overcards, which, if you look at our range, the solver is betting almost the entire portion of our range that we do have. Notice the solver does check ace 10. Like I said, if there's a hand you would want to check, ace 10 is a hand that would at least consider it. But like literally every other hand in our range wants to bet besides, I guess, ace. Do we even have ace 7? No, we don't even have ace 7. So solver wants to bet every hand in our range here. And, that's fine. So it's important to be able to look at this and see that solver's checking a little bit more often, but that's because it has a slightly weaker range in this particular scenario due to the way it structured its flop range. So, look, I realize that there is a lot to playing the turn well and that we've gone through a few examples here, and we're going to continue going through additional turn examples. We're not done with that yet. But I highly recommend you go through the homework at Poker Coaching. We have lots and lots of homework questions just like this that ask you, how would you play your range in these scenarios? And you need to be able to sit down, analyze your range, and figure it out so that you understand how to play all of the common spots you're likely to encounter. You have to spend a little bit of time thinking about these scenarios. And doing that is going to go a long, long way to ensure that you are playing great poker. Really though, in a lot of these spots, if you use logic, you can to some extent recognize which cards are better for you or your opponent and realize on the cards that are good for you, you keep betting a decent amount of the time. On the cards that are good for your opponent, you do more checking. And when you're out of position, you of course do more checking as well, which is why with 50% equity on the 6 or the 8, you actually check 100% of the time, right? Even though you do have some 6 and 8s in your range. So I understand that this is a difficult, intricate spot, but take your time, go slow, categorize your hands, and you're going to find that if you bet polarized on the flop, as you often will be doing, the turn actually plays itself pretty nicely, pretty easily, because you just keep betting polarized. It turns out it's not all that hard to keep betting polarized, and you're going to be pretty difficult to exploit at all if that's what you do.